Hi, I'm Willhelm Lehman. I represent IMWSoftware. And the first thing I wanted to at least quickly answer, not so sure if you're curious, is who am I? Been a Java developer for over 20 years. Been using Java since the mid-90s. Really passionate about Java. I like everything Java, so I use that hammer as much as I can. From time to time, I go to different frameworks like AngularJS or Kafka, but all in the context of Java. So everything that I want to do, usually I do it in Java if possible. And then I look at my secondaries. And obviously for UI, I use AngularJS or JavaScript environments. I also design cyber threat exchanges. I used to work for WebSys for a long time, and as a consequence, I've got biased, I suppose, by the cybersecurity world. And I consult companies on designing and implementing software. And obviously, I consult on cyber, and I consult on various technologies like Docker. And obviously, Docker is not Java, but anyway, various Java technologies. And the company I represent is IMWSoftware, which is a company that we founded. It does essentially a few things. Cybersecurity, where we offer solutions that simplify cyber threat exchanges and the sharing of this information from cyber defender communities. They're products, so you can use them as standalone, or you can use them as part of your deck or your stack, or you have a stack, which obviously many companies do have, so essentially we integrate with those stacks. If you don't, we can give you a stack, open source stack like Suricata, that allows you to do cyber detection. We also consult on microservices. So a lot of companies are trying to adopt this new buzzword, but microservices has been around longer than the buzzword itself. They're called tiny services, I suppose, or little services, or what anyone was calling them at the time. So we consult how to adopt microservices fast and easy. And we do just about anything else under the sun that we can do with Java. From business intelligence, I used to work many years ago, I used to work in a reporting environment where we were working on an exclusive company for business intelligence. So obviously I acquired that skill, so we know how to do that. And we do deployment and inventory system as well, and obviously cybersecurity. Now the goal today, how do we hide this thing? Anyway. I'm not going to ask that anyway. Okay, so the goal today obviously is to learn how to integrate MongoDB with Springwood. Now, I call this the focus. So we're going to focus on MongoDB. This sounds like I'm repeating myself, but you'll see that in a second. What I'm trying to say is that you have secondary effects. You're going to have MongoDB and Springwood as separate tools. Now, how many people here have used Spring Boot? Okay. So I'm going to try to thin out. I do have essentially a lot of material, and the more people have used Spring Boot, the better. So I'm going to try to speed through, and I'll explain how I did the tutorial. So essentially, I'll show that. How about MongoDB? How many people have used MongoDB here? So give or take the same. So I feel like I'm in a Congress, the yeas and the nays. Anyway, so here's my agenda, and it's not going to have an order. So, and I'll explain that in a second, but technically we're going to do this. We're going to try to introduce Spring Boot. We're going to try to introduce MongoDB with the installation, but I'm not going to go through the installation. I'm not going to do anything live because you fail more often than not. So I try to kind of just encapsulate everything in a preset environment. I even coded everything. So instead of me doing live coding and kind of see me fumble on the keyboard, you're simply going to look at the code already written. And this is going to speed things up, you know. We're going to look at a couple of MongoDB GUI tools. We're going to do things with MongoDB, like creating a MongoDB project. And we're going to flip back and forth between the queries in MongoDB and how would you do those queries in Spring Boot. And there are various queries. Obviously, there's aggregation as well as simple CRUD. You know, the usual create, read, update, and delete. But then you have aggregation, which things that get a little hairy. And creating an aggregation with Spring Boot can get a little challenging because there's not a whole lot of Googling you can do. And I try to kind of just create the project to show you these examples. And along the way, there may be some other topics which I cannot account for. You know, things may pop. So I call these other topics, whatever. And I'm going to try to wrap it up at that point. And although I'm going to have a final QA, obviously questions can show up at any given time. So, as I mentioned, the presentation is going to be a bit twisted because there are various topics. So I'm going to go back and forth. It may sound like I'm repeating myself, where I may make U-turns. I'm going to sort of go on a different road. I'm going to come back on that road later on. So I'm going to try to keep things as cohesive as possible, but slap me around if I don't. You know, kind of bring me back down to earth. I often lose track of what I'm trying to do. Remember only one thing, Spring Zen, and GitHub is your friend after that. This long name, I borrowed, I guess, from Spring. Spring likes long names. And so I guess I did the same. So you don't have to remember the project name, you just have to remember Spring Zen. And all my presentations except this one is in Markdown. So, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to end this there. And I'll simply go to the site, essentially to GitHub. So when we go to GitHub, is there a way to close this? I guess not. So if we go to GitHub.
The arrow? The green arrow?
The green arrow. Is that a green arrow? Oh, this?
The left.
Oh, thank you. I guess that kind of did something. Anyway, we're not really going to ask that. So anyway, so everything I'll present here, even the copy-paste code that you'll see me copying, stuff like this, you'll see me copying queries, it's in there. So everything that I do is here. So you don't have to make any notes. You don't have to take screenshots unless you really want to take a picture of me and let me know, because I can just pose. I'm really good at that, I suppose. But anyway, so if you look at my presentations, for example, if we take one, I picked one of them. As you can see, they're in Markdown, right? But I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to make you see the scroll. I simply use something called DECset that simply reads Markdown into slideware. That's why you see a lot of lines. I'm not addicted to lines, so in case you think why I have so many lines in my Markdown, it's just the way this DECset separates slides. So anyway, that's how my presentations will be. Okay, so I'm going to try to look and try to be as efficient as possible here. So it was difficult to kind of think which one would be the first one, so I picked this one as being the first slide. So setting up the Spring environment. So for some of you who actually set up Spring environment, I apologize if this is a repetition to you. And what I mean by setting up Spring environment, you'll see in a second, like this. Because this is a tutorial, you're going to see a lot of these steps. So if you've never set up a Spring environment, obviously you're going to see this here. But I'm not going to talk about Java and what Java is. I think that would be a waste of time. But without, I don't have to mention, but Java 8 is the version that we should be using, because I think Spring is going to drop anything below very soon. I think Java 5 is going to get rid of Java 7. If you want to use the command line options presented here, obviously you have to have enabled. Anything higher than 3 will do just fine. Now, some of you, when you install software, you probably use various forms, downloads, and so on. But if you use the SDK man, it's a better way to kind of just manage Java-based software. So this is a repository much like Brew or Yum or apt-get. So this is a nicer way to install Java software. And this is all very simple installation. I put everything, even the test, which is SDK version. This is all you need. If you copy this, you're good to go. So you don't have to mention any version. They'll give you the latest. And obviously you have to source this file. Now installing Spring Boot, and that's what maybe some of you haven't done this, but what I mean by Spring Boot, at least in this context, is Spring Boot CLI, where you want to kind of have the command line version, where you may be in a company where you want to standardize your Spring. Maybe you're not at that point, maybe you will be at some point, where you have, when you create Spring Boot, it's very wild. You have lots of options, and what do you do? What is this actuator thing, or whatever? But maybe you have someone in your company that is senior enough or been doing Spring Boot enough times that realizes what it means to have a Spring Boot environment. So maybe you automate your templates. So this is what I mean by Spring Boot. Obviously, there is no Spring Boot installation if you're using an IDE. It's just code, and jar files, I suppose. So SDK man is as simple as this. That's it, you're done. But if you like pain, and there's pain, I guess this would be the way to go. So you can go to the root URL, or you can go to the latest version. I bet you by the time we finish this presentation, maybe a few revisions will actually be released by Spring Boot folks. They're very much on speed. There's some sort of narcotic. They're releasing very fast. You know, obviously you unzip, untar, whatever, and add Spring CLI to your system. But if you use SDK man, all these things will be added to your environment of your pleasure, I suppose. Windows, Mac, or whatever. Once you're done, obviously this is what you do. You simply check the version. 154, the latest flavor. You can download 2.0. And by the way, maybe one day I can present the things that are available in 2.0/Spring 5. I've been playing around with 5. It has some nice, nifty features. I wish I could squeeze them into today's presentation, but because I put MongoDB into the pot, I simply disqualified myself from mentioning Spring 5. But if you guys want, we can have a session on Spring 5. Anyway, Docker, I put this because it's part of the tutorial. And later on, I'll mention more about Docker in the tutorial, and I'll update this tutorial. And by the way, I'm also trying to turn this tutorial into Udemy course. And in there, we'll have more explanations, I suppose. But you can still send me pull requests. You can contact me via GitHub or go to the website and contact us. I have some business cards as well, that sort of thing. Anyway, creating a Springwood project. There are 3 ways that I'll be mentioning. I won't be mentioning IntelliJ. The reason why I don't mention IntelliJ is because it costs money. So some of you folks maybe not using IntelliJ, at least the Ultimate Edition. And how many people are using IntelliJ? Okay, so minority for SDS. Okay, well, still, at least I live essentially on open source, and my promise is always to give free tools. I don't want anybody to have to buy tools because of what I brought in. It is up to you to buy something. Anyway, so when you go to the Spring Initializer site, you see this stuff, this thing. So you can type things in here. You can type, you can type Actuator, and you can begin to build your project this way. Obviously this is probably not the most optimal way to create the Springwood project, but if you've never done it, this is one way to do it. You can switch to the full version, and you can do all these things. And this is what I mentioned here. And here, because you're trying to build the MongoDB, you select the 1, 2, 3, 4. One thing that I haven't mentioned here is DevTools, but I'll update the slides later. Once you update, obviously you do the rest. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on Maven. Gradle, is it popular? Is anybody using it here, Gradle? Okay, that's nice, okay. Well, I don't use Gradle, I suppose. I've been using Maven for too long, and I just haven't gotten used to Gradle. Now, at this point, once you've set up the project and you've selected all the options, obviously you just click on that big button at the bottom in here, Generate Project, and obviously something will happen. It just downloads the zip. So obviously that's what this tutorial says. When you use the command line interface, you have to get accustomed to it a little bit. So one of the things that you want to know, like what does it do? Spring help before you do anything, and obviously Spring shell brings you to the shell. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's see if this is the Spring shell. I just hit Control L. Now I know the zoom will not work on a video, and I apologize for that. So for example, what you can do on the site, when you go on the site here, you have all these options, JMS, activity, and so on. You can do via the command line. And let's just try to zoom in into this. Right? So in here you can see Spring init list. And if I hit enter, and if the connection is fast enough, because it's going live, so essentially if you're in an airplane, don't try to do this because you'll get an immediate response saying you're not connected to the net. So for example, if we scroll, we can see the things that we can do via command line. All the options. If I want to have MySQL, if I want to have, I guess, Kafka, and so on. These are the options. So there's quite a few. So I'm not really going to scroll because it'll probably kind of become annoying. But these are the things that you could do via the command line, which is the same as through the IDE or through the site. And I'll show that in a second. So another thing that you can do, let's just zoom out. Another thing you can do with Spring is you can run the world's smallest REST application according to the folks at Spring. This is what they call tweetable code. So you can run this, you can take this Groovy app, and then essentially run it. And then you can access the site. there's questionable, there are questions as to why you do that. Obviously for prototyping, this is a great way to prototype immediately. So you can impress someone in a meeting and say, look, is this what you mean? Should we have the API this way? You can look, it just works. So you didn't have to kind of just go through the IDE, compile, find the libraries. You didn't have to do any Maven, Gradle, nothing. So it's very fast from that perspective. Now, when we create via command line, this would be a command that you just simply paste and voila. And obviously, I've set some options here like Maven. So for those of you who do Gradle, obviously you just have to type that in. But this would build a project. And in this case, it'll just put it into SDJUG demo folder. Now, when you build via Maven, a couple of things happen. And even Gradle, I suppose. Spring has this plugin. And what it does, it creates an executable jar. And obviously, this, for those of you who've used Spring Boot by now, this is probably obvious. You can do Java-jar, and you can run that, and it just runs by some miracle, I suppose. And that's because of this plugin. It just repackages it. Now, the goals are described here. So if you go to the command line, you can do MVN, describe this plugin, and it'll tell you what it does. So I'll talk about some of these options next. Now, the first thing is, okay, great. It creates a fat jar for me, but how do I get back to the world that I used to be before? How can I have a slim jar? Let's say you create a Spring Boot project that you want to share as a dependency, which, by the way, is kind of not recommended, but you just want to have that capability. You go into the plugin and add this configuration, essentially, to your plugin. And what that looks like in here, if I can get back to Palm, and here, you can see that essentially I added it here, right? So I added the configuration. As you can see, the default are these two lines, and everything else is not default. So in here, I added this configuration, and now what happens, I have a slim jar and a fat jar. Obviously, a slim jar will contain only the things that you depend on. Only your code and dependencies will be available, I guess, at runtime. So you won't get any jars included into that jar. So this allows you to simply pass that jar on to someone who depends on you, upload it to, I guess, a repository of some sort, or whatever. While you continue to have a fat jar, which allows you to run on your environment. Another thing that you do when you build, you have build info. Your build automation folks, they want to know when it was built and that sort of thing. And now Spring provides this for you. So you simply you can do MVN Spring Boot and you can add the build info, or you can permanently add it as a goal to this plugin. And what will happen, obviously that information becomes available. So you don't have to tell the folks in the build environment to put another command. Sometimes they say, can't you just simply do it yourself? So they'll simply just pick up the file, and that's good enough for me. Anyway, if you want to run via command line, that's about as much as you need as far as Maven is concerned, and this just runs. But obviously, if you want to run with Java, you do java-run and essentially the jar itself. And this kind of concludes this part. Let me know if I'm going too fast. Ask any questions. Let me know if you have any questions so far. No? Okay, I'm going to go and see what I need to do next. Okay, so I'm going to go to, MongoDB introduction. Sorry, Spring Boot introduction. So I'm trying to do things in this order. Let me know if this is not good for you and I can just change the order. But essentially right now I want to go through what I believe are essentials for Spring Boot when you start a Spring Boot project. What should you know first? And what I wish I had known at the time I started Spring Boot. And here they are. How to define a simple REST controller. How in the hell do I do this? So I wanted to know, like I had to Google, I couldn't find it. I would find Arjun, who was actually at the time working on it, Arjun Postma. I don't know if you guys know him. He's from Spring. He's the architect behind all the web services. So if you look for him, he's the guy to talk to if you have any questions. And the thing is, how do I configure Spring Boot application? How do I get these properties things? How do I define properties? What's built in? So this is another question that I had in mind. And then later on, what developer tools do I have available? And because, as I mentioned, Spring folks are really, really fast at coming up with new tools. They've removed some old tools and they've enhanced some newer ones. And DevTools is such a tool. It was enhanced, some of the older tools have died, and this encompasses some of those older tools. And how do I manage? How do I know my app is running? How do I know things are happening? You know, and this is what I'm going to talk about in relation to Spring Actuator. And obviously logging. I mean, obviously you've all done logging, but how does Springwood do that? Okay, so defining a simple REST controller. Without this value thing, all you need is to simply annotate. A REST controller, name your controller class, have a request mapping, and by default it's get. So I didn't have to mention that. Name it, give it a name, and you simply just return some string if you wanted to. Because obviously you wanted to simply hello world. You want to see, hey, does this thing work? You know, later you think of, well, how do I convert to JSON? But that comes later. The pain comes later. You know, first this is the demos, they say, you know. So demo is really looking really cool for you. And I'll talk about this my property stuff. But essentially this is injecting a value. Essentially injecting something from, obviously in this case would be from, let's say, a property file. But because Spring uses convention over configuration, that means you can pass in a command line, you can put it anywhere. If you have Spring config, you can have that in a config server, for example, and you can share it. If you use Spring Cloud, and by the way, if you guys want to learn about Spring Cloud, I can also do a section on Spring Cloud where we can talk about the whole cloudiness of Spring. And it gets a little sort of rainy at sometimes, you know, because it's just, you're not so sure what is this Eureka nonsense, Zool and Zipkin, you know, all these names, what do they mean as far as I'm concerned? So I can essentially explain those if you would like in a future session. But at least right now, essentially this property will reside locally. We're not really connecting to a configuration server. And I'll show how to do that. If you wanted to access this app, obviously right now what will happen, I've made some modifications and the port is different. So essentially if I were to access that, essentially it will just say that. Start an application with property, and because the property was defined, it says development property. You know, so obviously, ooh, look at that. I defined that property. You know, so that's sort of what this code does. You know, and as you notice, it's live. I'm sort of running Spring right now. Now, when we talk about configuration properties, essentially you have to configure your application. So there's some auto configurations that occur. There's some things that you like to do, and obviously you want to put a fork in the road. What happens if I release? What happens if I'm dev? You know, profiles. You know, when you define an application, the very first thing you'll see is this. After you define an application for the first time, it looks as exciting as this. You know, so essentially you see this annotation at Springboard application and something in main where it runs the application. Now, you can ask yourself, what is this Springboard application thing? You know, so it's a convenience wrapper annotation. Before you kind of have to put configuration, you have to put all these annotations. So your class just looked like a stack of annotations, and buried deep down was your code. So the folks at Spring understood that this sort of stack of annotations don't look nice. You know, if we want to make defaults for you, we're simply going to include them in the Springboard application. So that's what this means. Springboard application is a convenience annotation that wraps configuration, enables auto configuration, and components scan annotation. So what it does, it assumes that your class, your package is whatever it may be. In our case, in the demo here is com IMWSoftware. So everything builds from there. Obviously, you can override with add include, and you can do various things where you can override this behavior. But by default, Spring takes that approach. And the configuration class, the configuration annotation is something that states methods with bean annotation that register when your environment starts. Now, in here it says bean, and obviously it's not always bean. It's something that looks like a bean. Anything that's a dependency injection. Obviously, at value is not a bean, but it's something that he injects. So it's sort of a bean. So anything in a configuration class that injects gets picked up by Spring and essentially does the auto wiring for you, the injection and all that stuff. If it happens to be outside of your package, then obviously you have to import. You have to use the add import, and you have to add a configuration there. And when you configure, essentially this is what this means. When you have an add configuration, essentially this is what this means. You have a configuration class, you can call it anything you want, and a bean. And in this case, we're defining something called an endpoint, essentially. And we'll discuss about these endpoints in a few minutes. Essentially, these are actuator endpoints, because actuator defines a bunch of endpoints for you, /health, /bean, /whatever. One day you may think, well, great, how can I make one of these for myself? What if I want to hide all of them and have my own that simply does various things but hides some of the details in case I want to release actuator on a live app, but I want to disable some of these, and I'll discuss about disabling and so on in actuator, but I want to at least give you a clue as to what this class means. When you enable auto configuration, essentially what Spring tries to do, it tries to discover what's in your class path. It tries to discover what dependencies you've added, and it tries to figure out what they do. Now, obviously, the Spring dependencies they're smart, I suppose. They cheat. Maybe let's put it that way. They've done their homework. So, for example, if you include the log4j, not much is going to happen other than simply log4j become available for you. But the folks at Spring, they do things. They activate parts. So essentially, they expose configurations. So they kind of just do a lot of exchanges. So that's why, for example, suddenly an application where you actually did no coding, suddenly it works. It does something because Spring sees that, introspects, and it simply steals these configurations and makes them available by default. And obviously, you can disable that. Let's say one day you develop an application where you want to use the Spring, you include the Spring Boot dependency for Spring Security, but you don't want Spring Security to start. You just want to use the classes. You like how they did the encryption, decryption, whatever. You just like the utility classes that come with that. So what you can do, you can just disable it. So essentially, in your Spring Boot application, you can exclude the auto configuration. And suddenly, you just have that as a jar. So now you just have a dependency that just, it works for you, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't enable Spring Security. So you're not going to have to deal with disable security in your application properties, which is the first thing you do. Really, when you develop an application, the first thing is, it's asking me for a password. How do I disable this damn password? So you Google how do I disable it, say, enable equals false or basic equals false, whatever. So essentially you have to disable the security. But if you don't want to use Spring Security, you just disable it altogether.
Are there any other benefits for excluding our configuration classes aside from like disabling certain features like the security thing you mentioned? And then I know the boot time for the Spring Boot application can be improved by a little bit, depending on how much you exclude.
Well, yes. So essentially, when you look, essentially, what I do, I look to see what gets loaded. So when I see what gets loaded, some things I don't like, I disable them only, essentially for speed at first. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I disable them, like I said, because I just want to use the jar. That's it. So essentially, I'm in a module, and I don't want this thing to be a boot. Essentially, I don't know if you noticed, when you actually inherit from boot, it flags your application to be a boot application. Now, that's nice, but it's not always nice, because when you run it, it just runs as boot application. So maybe you don't want to do that. And like I said, when it runs as a boot application, it just runs all of these dependencies that you've included. And because the dependencies in Spring, they're like bombs. They include everything that comes with it. So it's a nice cheat. We say, just give me this thing, because I know you include, let's say if you include the MongoDB dependency, you know that it's going to bring the driver, it's going to bring you everything. So you don't have to have you don't have to kind of look, what does MongoDB dependency look like? So obviously you go to mvnrepository.com, you type MongoDB, you copy paste, but it gets repetitive, and then you figure out that this depends on something. Okay, is it a transitive dependency? What does that mean? Forget it. You just simply include the Spring, and you disable MongoDB auto configuration, and now you have MongoDB functionality in the sub-module. So that's it. So when you run the application, it doesn't load up everything except your application, which simply probably says, hello world, I've connected to MongoDB, whatever. But obviously, if you want to use Spring Boot, the top level project should probably have MongoDB enabled. Because really, in the end, that's why you're using Spring Boot. You want to get rid of all this nonsense. How do I do anything? Right now you have these fancy dependencies from Spring, which encapsulate all the sub-dependencies. So to make your adoption much easier. When when you switch databases, let's just say that one day MongoDB is no longer the database du jour, and Cassandra happens to be a cooler name, I suppose, you know, and now you just don't know, like, where do I go for Cassandra? Oh my God, you panic, you know? So you simply say, hey, let me just get this Springwood dependency, and within seconds you're done. Obviously, once the shock wears off, another shock comes in, you have to learn Cassandra, you know? But at least you kind of survived that day. At least you were able to say hello world in Cassandra within minutes, I suppose, you know, if you're fast enough with your Google. Essentially, if you want to add a simple configuration, this would be the simplest configuration I can think of. Obviously, it could be simpler if I just simply delete all the code. But essentially, this one in here, I defined a couple of things, which I'll explain in a minute. But remember the initializing bean nonsense that you have to do, the extends? Essentially, right now, you can obviously use post construct. But if you've done Spring for a while, obviously, this is no news to you. So obviously, you can use this annotation. Another thing, I keep injecting this value. And I'll explain in a second what these simple properties mean. So essentially, this would be a configuration class, and everything in here gets picked up. And when the application starts, you see this in the startup. Essentially, you see these sysouts. Before defining any configurations, go to Appendix A. You know, as they say, look at this. You know, there's lots of things in here. Essentially, lots of properties the Spring defines. So before defining anything, look for something. Let's say if you look for Mongo, I suppose, you know, looks like there's some Mongo stuff in here. So look for what they have before you define your own, and see what they mean. And using the @value injection, you can just inject those on your classes without having to do any other fancy stuff, like using a bean that simply resolves that property. No, just simply inject the value, and obviously make sure it's defined in your project. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So changing common application properties. Server port, I think everybody in the room who's used Spring Boot has done this first thing to see, oh, look, I can change the port number. What a nightmare this used to be with the Tomcat. You have to go to server XML. How do I do this? You have to, if you're clever, you would use Catalina.properties. Oh, look, I can do stuff that's really cool. I can go to Catalina properties, and then I can reference variables, which is something you can do in Tomcat. But Tomcat is a bit out of fashion these days, at least as far as that approach. You like to use Tomcat Embedded, which is what happens these days, because back in, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago, Tomcat became available as an embeddable project. So you could actually embed it, and you can run it within, much like you could run, I forget what, Jetty at that time. Jetty was the only embeddable. But now, obviously, you have other ones that can be embedded, obviously, including Tomcat. So this is how you override that. And here we go, the property. This is a test, and you inject it. So let's just have a look at that property in here for a second. And here, if we zoom in, and I know on the video, maybe this doesn't zoom in on the screen recording, but essentially I'm going to application.properties, and I'm zooming into my property. So anyway, this is it. Pretty boring stuff. But anyway, that's what it looks like, I suppose. So that's what it looks like in there. And now you can inject it. One gotcha. If you don't define it, Spring will complain, because it's like when you define it, when you reference a bean, you say, I'm looking for this bean, and obviously it doesn't exist. Spring will say, I couldn't find the bean. You're trying to inject something that doesn't exist. So this is what this will do. Now, the previous approach is very fine for 1, 2, 10 properties, but what happens if you want to define many and you want to group them? You keep typing my dot, I don't like that, you know, or maybe you do, but I don't. But you can group them, you can give them names, you can actually have something, in this case it's called simple properties, but let's say you had Mongo properties as a class. You define everything that you want to define about Mongo, you know, and now you group them. And in here, you define this as a component, and you give it a prefix. Make sure you always give it a prefix, because otherwise you're going to lose your mind looking for this name. Because you're going to try to think, what was the class called again? Simple something. I mean, if somebody has a really long name, and you just don't know what it begins with, you're just going to keep trying to guess. So obviously, if you have something like simple, or some name, obviously MongoDB, something that means something to you. You know, ResMed. You know, if you have ResMed dot version, and then but otherwise, if you have a class called the ultimate class. Obviously, it'll be something like ultimate class.version. So that's probably not what you had in mind. And you don't want to match these for whatever reason, because maybe simple doesn't mean anything. Or MongoDB, you don't want to define things as MongoDB because you don't want things to be called MongoDB in your world. Because MongoDB should keep those names. Anyway, another thing that happens here is the validated part. We try to validate. So essentially, if this property is defined, we want to make sure that at least the name is defined. Otherwise, we're going to fail the startup. We're going to say, look, you have to define the name. Otherwise, I'm not starting this thing out. So that's what we do. Now, when you reference, essentially, when you define them, you can define simple properties, enable true, obviously, because they're Boolean, so it actually recognizes that. You can do code completion, so it'll actually recognize that as a Boolean. And you can do placeholders. And obviously, this would be a candidate for null pointer exception, I suppose, in Spring, if you didn't define name, so maybe you want to make sure it's not null before it starts. So obviously, here you want this to say null is a collection of properties. So that's probably a good reason to kind of say, make sure it's not null when the application starts. So that's sort of a way to add your custom properties. Profiles. How many of you have used profiles in Spring? Oh, almost everybody. Okay, so this is no news for everybody, for anybody. So essentially, you can set profiles. Boo-hoo. So anyway, there are many ways to set profiles. Through the command line, Maven, you can set it to programmatically, but I question if you were doing programmatically, that's a big if. I mean, if you begin to program profiles, maybe Spring is not for you. So you should use something more flexible. Like the command line. You don't want to program anything that has to be dynamic, because you don't want the profile to be hard-coded in your code. You call it dev today, but maybe it's going to be development tomorrow. So you have to kind of search for dev. And if you have packages that have, let's say, IMWSoftware.dev, you're going to have like a million of these in your file. You're going to have to figure out, where did I define this dev? Anyway, and in here, as an example, we're going to show YAML, how we override these properties using YAML. So what I did here, I went to the YAML properties, and I defined the development properties. So I've written everything that was in application properties, at least everything that I wanted to override. Because everything else remains as whatever it was if I don't override it. The default or whatever I had in the base. So in here I'm simply saying, hey, look, it's a development property, as you probably noticed in the screen when I showed the example. And in here I'm saying this is a simple development property, and I'm overriding 2 ports. And I'll explain the second port in a minute, I suppose, when we get to Actuator. All right. I was just about to do Zorba the Greek, but I wasn't sure if that was the theme for today. But anyway, so that's what we do in that YAML file. So essentially right now, the next thing that we have to do once we define the YAML file, we have to enable the profile. And as I mentioned in this example, I'm going to use property files itself. So back to property files in here, I define this spring.profile.active. And I'm saying, hey, this is development. And that's it. It's as simple as that. So suddenly this profile becomes active. But you probably notice profiles. So obviously you can have many profiles active. You could piggyback if you wanted to, So, and I think they're order dependent, but you have to check that. So if you keep overriding settings, at some point you're going to lose your mind, figure out which port did it pick up. So you're going to try to just simply, if you keep overriding ports, you're going to have to kind of just simply toss a coin and figure out which one is going to be active. Or obviously not toss a coin, simply look at Spring as it starts up and see which ports picked up. And then you know how the order worked in this case. Because this is a tutorial, I repeated this in the slides. Essentially, this is how you define a YAML. YAML files are a bit crazy because their syntax is a bit unusual. And one thing you'll notice, if you have a file called something.properties or .yaml, you have completion. So for example, if I do this, I have code completion. But if the properties file is not essentially the default name, nothing happens when I do no code completion for me, no soup for you, because you just named it something else. I'm not so sure how to do code completion when the file is not the default. So obviously, a cheat would be to simply just rename your original rename this to something and then simply do the code completion and then rename it back, I suppose. But somehow, when it's not the default name, it doesn't pick up, it doesn't do code completion for you. So if you make any typos, obviously you can end up with an original configuration. You think you're actually referencing something Spring, but because you probably typed Sprung, I suppose your Sprung version is probably going to be the one you'd be referencing. It's probably not what you're looking for, maybe. So be careful of that. Now, DevTools can be a great tool, or it can be the most annoying tool you've ever used. So it's sort of, the jury's still out to some extent. So I'll explain how to kind of mess with it, to kind of just not make it so annoying. Essentially, the annoying part is the automatic server restarts. Now, that can be very annoying at some times when you develop and you start on the server and you develop, and every time you hit save, this thing just keeps rebooting itself. It restarts, obviously, as you're typing, let's say, a description. And you just happen to like the save button. Every time you hit save, it'll pick it up. So, before we get there, we'll talk about the dependency, because I didn't put this in a default tutorial where you pick web, Actuator, the docs, and MongoDB. Obviously, you have to paste this in, right? There's no easier way to do this. There's no way you can go to Spring SDS and say, hey, look, I want to add another dependency, you know? Obviously, you can, but you have to kind of just go to Maven, where you say, Maven, add me this particular dependency, or if you use IntelliJ, IntelliJ has a much, much better integration with Maven or even Gradle. And it's easier for you to type in dependencies that you want to add. Obviously, Eclipse probably should just hit the, delete on all their code and kind of start from scratch at some point, but that's a different topic. So this is what happens, essentially, by default with DevTools. One of the things that happens, essentially, you have automatic restarts. Now, essentially, Springwood uses two class loaders, one for your code and one for its infrastructure. And this is actually good for you, because the restarts are faster, but obviously they'll be as fast as your code base. You know, if you have two classes, guess what? Things will be very fast. But if you have 20,000 classes, I guess things will be very slow. So every time you hit save, obviously just imagine this thing restarting. Now, another gotcha is that this is IDE dependent. In SDS, things are very easy, because Spring develops essentially this plugin on top of Eclipse. They make sure they enable everything, which is really not much. All they have to do enable is build project automatically, which I think Eclipse has it enabled by default to begin with. But in IntelliJ, you can enable build project automatically, but then you have to open the registry, not Windows registry, God forbid. I mean, obviously, if you're Mac, you're not going to find Windows registry there. This IntelliJ registry, and check this one. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. Every time you hit save, nothing's going to happen. But what the? This DevTools is useless to me. It doesn't do anything. You know, that's because this particular setting is not there. But obviously, you can Google Springwood DevTools restart IntelliJ, and obviously, you're probably going to have the entire community shouting, "Just check this, and you're going to be fine." If you want to ignore things, like let's just say you're cool. I mean, you still like the restart to happen, but I don't want it to happen when I code in, let's say, in my mob classes. Every time I modify a bean, I don't want this thing to restart. That's cool, because I don't want to, because I'm in the middle of developing. You can just, essentially in your properties, you can say spring.devtools.restart exclude. And by the way, in the project that I built, essentially, I've added all these properties, and they're commented out. So you don't have to type any of this stuff. If you go to GitHub and simply fork or whatever, clone this project, I suppose, you can see all these things. So you don't have to type any of this. And by the way, it's also in this doc mentioned. So the files in this package and sub-packages will be ignored. Now, another thing that happens when you develop big projects, you have sub-modules, right? And what if you wanted to add these sub-modules to your restart sequence? You're developing the sub-module, and then when you say, okay, so I made this change, but nothing is happening. You know, you have to restart all these sub-modules. Now, if you want to do that, if you want to add restart functionality based on sub-modules, you can just include them as well. And then Spring will try to accommodate. You know, so this helps you. But I think you have to make changes, obviously code changes, so yeah. So your project will restart based on that as well. Now, another thing that you may want to do, you may want to say, look, I want to hack this functionality a little bit cleverly. I'm going to put a sort of a tag file, like a trigger file. So unless I touch this trigger file, don't do anything. So you can put a trigger file, you can modify it to your heart's content, and then you go in and say hello and save it. And then suddenly things restart. But the trigger file does nothing if you didn't change any code, right? So it still looks at the code and says, well, nothing's changed, so you can keep typing. You can type your resume backwards if you want, but nothing is going to happen. So obviously the trigger file doesn't just simply restart Spring Boot. Your code changes will, but this is the trigger file, you know? And well, one day you get sick of it all and say, okay, just disable this for a while, okay? You know, tag files or not, I'm just going to disable this for a while. It's going to take a break. So you can do that too, because you have so many changes, you're just not sure what's going on. Nothing works anyway, so forget it. Don't restart anything, you know? So now Spring Boot Actuator. How many people here have used Spring Boot Actuator? Okay, cool. So does anybody use Jersey? Or, okay, so you probably want to read this thing at the bottom, you know? Essentially, you have to enable Spring MVC. Otherwise, Spring Boot Actuator is not going to work for you. You know, so that's the note that I made sure I copied in there. So there are a bunch of things that are enabled in Spring Boot Actuator, metrics and all sorts of things, but they're also kind of security sensitive. Some things do not magically appear just because you've enabled Spring Boot Actuator. So I'll show you some of the things that show up when you enable or quote unquote disable essentially security, or you enable sensitive to true, like show me sensitive stuff, like beans. Like you would want to deploy something out there and say, look, here are all the beans. So obviously, Joe Hacker, I suppose, you know, like, do cybersecurity as well. So obviously, that would be something that would be too obvious for someone who'd be like, oh, look at that /beans. I could just figure out everything these guys do. You know, not to mention that I know that they use Spring Boot Actuator, so obviously I figured that out. Obviously, that goes into their roster of things to look for on any application. They just go for opportunistic stuff, you know. Anyway, so what does Spring Boot Actuator feature? It has, not by default, REST docs. Now I highly recommend that you install the REST docs, essentially, because you can see what each endpoint does. Not to mention that you can access it, and you can look at some of the things that Spring Boot does as opposed to Googling. So for example, here's what I mean by that. So for example, if I go here, and if I type /docs, okay, that was that. Oh yeah, because of course, host, I keep typing localhost, and I think I changed the 9898 and docs. So essentially, and I'll explain that in a minute, I've changed the port number only because I don't want it to collide with my REST endpoints. If I have something called health, I don't want Actuator to steal it. Of course, I could just simply override the context, which I'll explain as well. But in here, you can see everything there is to know about these endpoints. And this is a nice way to kind of just see that. Plus, the thing that I like is the curl examples that are here. So I can simply look at curl and I can figure out how to simply access these metrics using curl. You know, so I can see what's up, and at least how Spring recommends, and what they look at in terms of responses. They show their responses, so it's kind of cool that you can see this in an example. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend that you enable the REST docs for Actuator. And I think I mentioned the dependency here. Okay, I do. And of course, by default, you have these health indicators, you have metrics, and voila, the ability to create your own. And I mentioned that earlier. So include this Actuator. Obviously, you have to include the Actuator as a dependency, and Actuator docs as a dependency. Now, you can disable certain access points, like if you don't like them to be exposed. You only want to have certain endpoints, let's say only yours, you know? So essentially, you can just disable one by one, and they no longer show up. And if you want to enable sensitive stuff, like beans, beans is a sensitive, and here it probably says beans, it probably says, hey, this is sensitive. Someone here should say this is sensitive. doesn't say there. So it's a sensitive endpoint. You'll have to trust me on this one, because if you don't have sensitive essentially enabled, you won't see beans. So we'll go to localhost, and we'll go to, again, I think I'm going to the default port, 9898. Essentially, you can begin to see what beans are loaded. Now, you begin to realize what's happening when you haven't disabled certain features of Springwood. This would be probably a good reason to kind of revisit what's loaded by default. Okay, you can see there are a lot of beans that get loaded. And by the way, if you don't have a plugin, this is what this thing looks like in your browser, right? So it looks kind of nasty. It looks like this. So it's not very readable. So just get a sort of JSON plugin so you can see these things. And you can obviously minimize sections and see only the sections you're interested in. Okay? So that's what that means. So when I enable sensitive, I can see that. Another thing that I can do is I can essentially disable security. And what that means, when I go to /health, I can see more. Obviously, you probably don't want to do this in a release, but essentially, you can see more. By default, health just shows up, and that's it. Good night. You know, because really, that's all you want to know. And usually, when you do Spring Cloud integration, one of the recommendations when you do Spring Cloud is to have Actuator, because that's how things are actually discovered. It looks for the health endpoint. Or you can simply just make up your own health, and obviously you don't have to use Actuator. You can simply just fake that, I suppose, write your own endpoint for that. But in here it shows you that I have Mongo, and right now it's saying it's using Mongo 3.4. Obviously, if you have this out there in the world, people know that Mongo is maybe easy to hack, maybe. So they'll simply try to hammer specifics on your application, especially if you somehow made a mistake and exposed Mongo as essentially as a query. Essentially, when you exposed your UI, you've also exposed the queries. Essentially, now they know through your application they can pipe into your Mongo. And maybe that's not something that you want to do. You know, that's why you have microservices. Essentially, delegate that, maybe. And then you have the refresh scope. And in this case, I also included Hystrix only as a means to show that if you have Hystrix, it'll tell you that it's up. So you can see that too, but only when you disable the security, because it's beginning to break down things for you. And obviously I showed this as an example in here too. You can change the context. You don't have to change the port in order to change the context, right? So let's just say you want to keep the same port, let's say 8080, everybody's happy with that port, they've got addicted to it, so you want to keep that addiction going. You can just change the context. You know, so now you say, instead of /health, you say /manage/health. You know, so this makes collision hopefully impossible, unless, you know, a newbie comes in and says, I'm going to make an endpoint called manage. Let's see what happens then. But that's a story that you'll have to deal with later. Now, if you want to see all the endpoints that are exposed, you can simply do /actuator, so that you can see everything that's being exposed. And you have to have Spring HITOAS, however we pronounce that word. HITOAS, thank you. Lots of hate there. I don't like the hate part, but anyway. So you have to have this in the class path, you know. But now comes the fun part. Let's just say you like to essentially expose certain parts of your application. You have the sensitive turned off, and you have the security set to false, which means now you still want to see things from your application, but in a way that no one else can recognize what that means outside of your company. You create a custom endpoint. So at this point, all these constructors really boil down to this method, invoke, because you've simply extended this abstract endpoint, and in this case, you are returning a string, I guess, and essentially a custom endpoint just does what it's supposed to do. So now you can simply, if you wanted to have, hey, look, we expose the version of Mongo, but we simply just don't say it's Mongo, we simply say version. You know, so we have things that we understand, or some things that you want to expose from an application that may not be relevant to anyone else outside of your company. Now, when you enable such a thing, you have to register it. So remember, I showed this as an example, as a configuration. So essentially, this is how you would enable it. And if we look at the constructor, we probably use the second one where we said this is not sensitive. So when the sensitive flag is on or off, it doesn't matter. Your endpoint will always show, right? So if you have to have a sensitive endpoint, obviously you want to make this true, I suppose, and then Spring will toggle that off if it's a sensitive endpoint. Spring logging. I'm going to talk a little bit about this stuff. Log formats, configuring logs. Oh, it's there you go. I'm almost done. This is actually the slide where we can end.
Okay.
2 more slides, I think.
Okay.
So the Spring log format looks like this. Then you can read this at your leisure. I just wrote it here just so you can see it. And if you want to turn debug on, that's about as much as you need. Or you can do it from a command line, you can say --debug, and Spring just turns debug on in your Spring environment. Sometimes Spring doesn't do coloring when you run from command line. That's because it didn't discover the coloring in ANSI console. And you can set that to always. And when you set it to always, it does the coloring no matter what. Of course, if your ANSI console supports it. But if it didn't detect it using auto-detect, color is good sometimes when you run on someone else's box because you can see things easier. You can see your warnings, you can see some things, some of the classes that you want to see. Trust me, for debugging, when you debug remote and all you have is a console, color helps. If you want to override the default log, you can simply say logging.file and you can just mention the file name. If you want to override the path, you can override it too, obviously. Log levels, this is easy. Or you can do log levels by packages. Everybody else, info, only these particular this particular package should have debug because I'm just developing the util. I want to figure out what's going on when somebody uses my util package. So that's it. We can take a break.
Okay.